Versus Robert Durst. Mr. Durst is present, Mr. DeGuerin and Mr. Chesnoff. We have most of the prosecution team, all of the prosecution team here. And also, I know there's an inquiry about our schedule on the week of the 16th of August. We'll be here on the 16th, we'll be here on the 17th, we'll be here on the morning of the 18th. We are going to not be in session the afternoon of the 18th. The 19th, I expect the court will be dark, but I'm hedging. I'm hedging a little bit. And so if it all goes as it has been going and as planned, we'll have that day off. Because I'm hedging, I'm asking that you not make plans for that day before you check with me. Write me a note if there's something that it has come up. Right? The 20th, that Friday, we're off. And juror number 1, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, what about the week of the 9th?
The week of the 9th, we start late on the 9th, 11 a.m. The 10th, we will not be here. We're dark. The 11th is a full day. The 12th, we leave early. We have a juror appointment, so we're going to leave an hour early. We'll go until 3:30 on that day. That Friday, we'll be off. Okay. Right. Now, Mr. Henderson.
Yes, Ron. Next, people will be calling Nick Chavin. This is going to be a 6-hour and 16-minute video, and a little bit of reading after that. We'll mark the video as a flash drive 281. The transcript is 281A.
And the reason there will be reading is the camera failed during the conditional examination, so we'll read the transcript of part of it.
Correct. There was a camera malfunction issue, so but we do have the transcript. We'll read that portion.
To be fair, it wasn't so much the camera was operator error. The person had it on pause the entire time and did not realize.
Right.
To be fair as well, that person is not in this courtroom.
Sir, please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly state that the testimony you're about to give in the cause content before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Please be seated in the witness stand. Please state and spell your first and last name.
Nathan Allen Chavin, Nathan Chavin, as in Victor, I-N.
Thank you.
You may proceed, Mr. Miller.
Mr. Chavin, how old are you?
72, sir.
And I'm not asking you specifically where you live, but can you tell me in what state do you live?
New York State.
And when did you come out to Los Angeles with respect to testifying in this proceeding?
Last Saturday, I believe. Saturday or Sunday.
Meaning 4 days ago, or did you meet the weekend of January 30th, 31st, around that time?
The weekend of the 30th or 31st, yes. Been a few days.
So you've been in Los Angeles going on a week and a half roughly, is that correct?
That's correct.
And during that time, the two gentlemen that are seated to your left, that are in the jury box, do you recognize them?
Yes, I do.
Who are they?
They're a security detail that was assigned to staying with me every minute.
And when you say security detail, are those security officers that you're employing?
No,
Mr. Jacob, you've had a team of officers from Los Angeles Police Department, Metro Division, who have been providing security for the last 2 weeks, 24 hours a day. Is that correct?
That's
Week and a
correct.
half, I'm sorry.
That's
Is that
correct.
As you sit here today, as you're listening to my questions, if there's something you don't understand, will you please let me know?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
Sure. If there's a question I ask that you don't understand, will you let me know?
Yes, yes.
And if there is something that I ask you that you simply do not have an answer to, do you have any problem saying, I don't know, or I don't remember?
No, that's what I would say.
All right. I want to ask you, as you sit here today, do you know this man right here? And I'm pointing to the defendant.
Yes, I do.
Will the record reflect the pointing at the defendant?
The record may so reflect.
Can you tell me what his name is?
Yes, Robert Durst.
Man, do you know him as Robert?
I know him as Bob and Bobby.
And can you tell me, how do you know Mr. Durst?
Well, I've known Bob Durst for 25 or 30 years. And you're asking how I know him chronologically?
Yes, how'd you meet Mr. Durst?
I met Bob Durst through a very dear friend of mine, Susan Berman.
The photograph, Your Honor, that I would like to mark as People's Woman for the purposes of this proceeding. I've shown counsel provided in the photo previously.
People's three. This
People's
is
three.
the one exhibit that you seek to introduce
Okay.
with reference to a conditional evidence.
Okay, so we'll put this as 3.
Yeah.
Can we get a chance to look at People's 3?
Yes?
Can you tell me, do you recognize the 2 people that are depicted?
Oh, yes.
And can you tell me who they are?
Bob Durst and Susan Berman.
Any idea, looking at this picture, do you have any idea approximately how old it would have been?
How old they would have been?
You know, how old the picture is, in other words, when this photo would have been taken approximately?
30 years ago?
Did you know, you
Sorry.
testified you met Susan Berman through Bob Durst? I'm
Yes.
sorry, you met Bob Durst through Susan
Yes.
Berman, is that correct? How did you first meet, we'll start at the beginning, how did you first meet Susan Berman?
I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I was a performer. And my manager, my agent as a performer, told me there was someone he wanted me to meet, and she was a writer. And she wrote music reviews, and we were always anxious to have, publicity for a music reviewer. So I was sitting on the washing machine in her basement, and Tom White, my manager, came in with Susan Berman, and we met, and we felt like kindred spirits. I hadn't moved to New York yet, and I don't think she had either. She was living in San Francisco. So we met. She wrote a few short pieces about me and my band, and then I moved to New York. And then,
I'm gonna stop you. When was it that you think you met Susan? What period of time was it?
approximately 1977.
So you indicated you moved to New York.
Yes.
Prior to that time, did you and Susan develop a friendship in San Francisco?
We developed a friendship in New York because she was going up and back, as I recall, from New York to San Francisco. She hadn't made the move completely.
How close of a friend was Susan to you at that time?
Pretty close, but about to become a lot closer. Excuse me, closer.
And was that a platonic or romantic relationship?
It was not romantic, but platonic and social, but not romantic.
How often would you see Susan when she was in San Francisco, when you were in San Francisco?
Not very often, 2 or 3 times is all. But then I moved to New York.
You said you were in a band, correct?
Yes.
Did you become a rock star?
Well, I became a rock meteor. I was a little smaller than a star. I did make records.
At the time that you moved to New York, did you have a young child?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell me, the young child that you had, was that a child that had involvement with Susan.
Yes, she did.
And can you tell me, was there anything about the relationship with your daughter that accelerated the relationship that you had with Susan?
Yes, there was.
Can you please describe what that was, please?
When I came to New York, my wife and I decided that I would raise, for at least a few years, my daughter by myself. And we needed to have her brought to New York. And we asked Susan Berman if she would accompany our 5-year-old daughter to New York. And I knew Susan well, but, you know, it's a pretty serious thing to have someone bring your 5-year-old daughter.
So, did Susan bring your daughter back to New York?
Yes, she did.
Can you explain why it was that this trip Susan took to New York with your daughter, why that deepened your friendship with Susan?
Because she lived up to the trust we had put into her, and she made Brandy happy and secure, and I would love her forever for that.
When you said Susan took your daughter, was that just Susan and your daughter by herself?
Yes,
How well did Susan know your daughter at that point?
that was the first time she ever met her.
And so Susan was the kind of friend that offered to take your daughter unaccompanied on that trip?
Yes,
By the way, do you remember, did they fly? How did they do that?
they flew.
And did you meet them in New York?
Yes, at the airport.
When Susan got to New York, she's in New York, you're in New York, is this before or after you had met Mr. Durst?
It was before when she got to New York.
So you'd already met Mr. Durst in San Francisco?
No, I didn't mean to say that. I hadn't met Mr. Durst yet.
So you get to New York, and can you tell me when you got there, what did you do?
Well, I had to get what musicians call a day job, so I began looking for work.
And at that point, had you gone to college?
Oh, yes.
And what kind of degree do you have?
I have a BA in English and a master's degree in creative writing.
And what schools did you attend?
The University of Texas as an undergraduate and San Francisco State University as a graduate student.
You didn't know Mr. DeGuerin when you were at the University of Texas, did you?
No.
You're actually from Texas originally, is that correct?
Well, originally Chicago and then El Paso, Texas for most of my life, yeah.
So you get to New York, and the way you were explaining, were you and your wife separating at that time, or just doing a job? I'm trying to understand.
It was somewhere in between that. We didn't want to do anything as serious as a divorce, so we separated.
And that's not the woman you're currently married to, is it
No,
correct?
no, it's not.
You get to New York, and you want to find a day job. What do you end up doing?
I ended up with a sort of a beginner's job as a copywriter in an advertising agency.
And around this time, is that when you met Mr. Durst?
Yes, it is.
Can you describe how you met him?
I met him through Susan Berman. I just can't remember the exact first time that we met. But we became friends, or the three of us became friends.
And in terms of your relationship with him, was it, at the beginning, was it social, was it professional, was it a mix?
It was social, purely social.
And at the time that you met Mr. Durst, and again, I'm just asking you to estimate on the years. Do you have any idea what year it would have been when you first met?
1980.
And at that time, was Mr. Durst, was he married?
Yes, he was.
And do you remember what his wife's name was?
Yes.
The mark is People's 4, Your Honor, with the court's permission. I have another photograph previously been provided to counsel. This is LA DA stamp 2999. Karen, do you recognize who that is?
That's Kathy Durst.
And can you tell me, does that look like the Kathy Durst the way that you remember?
No. I mean, I can tell it's the same person, but it doesn't look the same in terms of years.
Do you think, is she younger here or older than you?
Younger.
So Kathy Durst, you remember, was a little bit older than this.
Yes.
I want to go back to your relationship with Bob Durst. You said the two of you met, and did you hit it off right away?
Yeah, I would say yes, we did.
And what kind of stuff would you and Mr. Durst do together?
We went out socially. We had what we called boys' night out, and we'd go out and go to nightclubs and bars.
And was the pursuit of female companionship part of what you and Mr. Durst would do?
Yes, to an extent, yes.
And by this point, are you separated, divorced? What's your status?
We didn't get, my status was married but separated.
And what was Mr. Durst's status?
Married, I believe, yeah.
Did Mr. Durst ever explain to you, or did you ever ask anything about how his marriage to Kathy affected his pursuit of women at bars?
There were times when we would double date, where Bob would go out with Kathy and I'd go out with a female friend of mine, just, there were several. And there were times when we would each go out with different women and he wasn't with Kathy. So we double dated sometimes with two women that were new to us, and some, or relatively new, and sometimes where I had a girlfriend, sort of temporary girlfriend, and Bob went out with his wife. And he, had you asked me if he described his marriage, I believe.
Did Mr. Durst ever explain to you, did you ever have a discussion with him about why he was out dating other women when he was married?
Yes, but not that directly the way, I mean, boys talk differently, sir. He described his marriage as open. Bob described his marriage as open, and of course I was still married, though I wasn't with my wife, so there was nothing unusual about this. And those were looser times, I think, but he described it as open. Open meaning dating other women.
And sometimes when you would go out with Mr. Durst, would Susan Berman accompany you?
On a few occasions, yes.
As far as you knew, you said your relationship with Susan was platonic. As far as you knew, was Bob's relationship with Susan platonic as well?
Yes, but very close.
Mr. Chairman, I want to go back to Susan Berman. Can you tell me, in terms of her generosity, was she a generous person?
Exceedingly so, especially to me and my daughter.
And at the time that you knew Susan, back at this time period, was it fair to say that she was becoming somewhat of a successful writer?
Yes.
Financially speaking, back then, did Susan appear to be financially comfortable?
Yes, she talked about a trust fund.
And did you know Susan at that point in her life, when you would see her, was she the kind of person that was kind of pinching pennies, or was she the kind of person that was very financially generous with her friends?
Generous to a fault. I can give an example if you want.
Please.
She came over to my apartment once with a box from Paul Stewart. She said, "This is your basic navy blue blazer, and you wear it with jeans when you're going out socially, and you wear it to work. And it's a must-have," and it was about $300 or $400 then, and I was utterly ignorant on how to behave in New York. And she would do that sort of thing. She supported my daughter with presents and at her kindergarten graduation. She did everything for us. I mean, she was like a second mother.
At that time, was Mr. Durst, were you aware that he was wealthy?
I was beginning, yes, I guess, yes.
And was Mr. Durst, at that point in time, as generous with his money?
No, but I never asked for it. Bob, I never asked Bob for anything, and I really never asked Susan. She just offered it. So I don't know how generous he was with other people, but with me, we were two guys going out. We paid our own way, and that was that.
And so when you went out with Mr. Durst, for the most part, you each paid your own way?
Yes.
Can you tell me, did Susan Berman, when I say the term phobia, and I say Susan Berman, can you tell me, does that draw any response from you?
Yes, she was utterly phobic. I can give an example if you want.
Go ahead.
She made me swear to her, she would call me if she had a meeting in a high floor in a building, and she would make me swear that I would hit her in the head with an ashtray if she tried to jump out. So the instruction was that I would hit her in the head with an ashtray if she tried to jump out the window and kill herself.
Did you ever have to take her out?
No, it was, and I wasn't the only one she told that to. She was afraid of bridges.
Was Susan Berman also very particular about her food?
Utterly, and to a far-reaching extent. She would quiz mercilessly a waiter in a restaurant. Chicken had to be prepared a certain way. Everything had to be exactly as she wanted it.
Can you tell me what kinds of things that how would she be phobic at the restaurant?
Well, first there were only 2, I believe, restaurants she would eat at, no matter what. And she ordered chicken, always prepared a certain way. And she'd start screeching at the waiter if he forgot. She wanted the waiter to remember her, and usually they did, exactly as she wanted her food, so there wasn't usually a scene. But if she didn't get it the way she wanted, she'd either walk out, we'd both walk out, or she'd scream.
I don't want to go through all the areas, but I want to ask you in general, was Susan a person that in many different areas of her life would be very tied into either rituals or phobias in terms of how she...
Yes, to an amazing extent. And it never impeded my relationship with her, but she certainly had some quirks and neuroses.
Was Susan the kind of person, so I want to ask you, you're from New York, correct?
Well, the last 20 years or so, yeah.
There's kind of a stereotype that, people in Kansas, leave their doors unlocked.
Right.
People, Susan that kind of person?
No.
And when you say no, would that be a kind of a subtle no or an emphatic no?
Well, emphatic, she wasn't afraid of being robbed, but she always locked her doors, and she was suspicious of strangers.
So you end up meeting Mr. Durst, and early in the relationship, did you find out kind of who he was in terms of the family name?
Yes, I did. And do you want me to explain?
Please explain, yes.
I was doing advertising at an agency. I was a copywriter. And Bob called me one day and said, we have this new building we're building, 1155 Avenue of the Americas. You want to do the advertising for it? This is an utterly strange question to ask a newbie in advertising if he would want to take control of a big account coming into an agency, the largest one at the agency.
Did this up your status as a copy boy in your agency?
Well, not a copy boy, a copywriter.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't even know what the difference is, but I wasn't a boy. Yes, it did tremendously. I wasn't experienced enough to actually talk about anything. They let me sit in on some of the meetings, but basically I just observed, and they all sort of paid homage to me for bringing the account in. But that was how I learned about real estate advertising, which would later be the touchstone of the agency.
Was the advertising job that you got, was it at a real estate advertising firm or just an advertising firm you brought in?
It was an advertising firm with 1 or 2 real estate accounts, but Durst and the guy that the owner of the agency called the developer now had this building on 5th Avenue, Trump Tower, that she had brought in, and so we had Durst and Trump, and no one knew who Trump was. She called him the developer.
He went somewhere, I can't think of, that's a very familiar name.
Yeah, maybe someone else you're thinking of. But
I assume that's going to be the President Trump now?
yeah.
Okay.
And
And
by the time we try the case.
Yes. Well said.
Mr. Chavin, when you took the stand, we called you as Nathan Chavin. Who called you Nathan?
No one but the driver's license people.
What name do you go by?
Nick is the name of the guy.
So, Mr. Chavin, you get the get the, offered you the account?
The Durst account, yes.
And by the way, how big of an account, if you can recall at that point, was this?
It probably would bill $300,000 or $400,000 during the development of the building. But that was a lot more money then than it is now.
Is it at least $300,000 or $400,000, is that per year?
Yeah,
And
until the building was leased up.
And in getting this account, if I were to ask you, how instrumental was that in accelerating your career? What would be your response?
It was 100% responsible until I began to get other accounts because I had the Durst account. All I had to do was walk in somewhere and say, yes, I have the Durst organization account, and I would get other accounts, which I wouldn't have gotten if I didn't have the Durst account. Does that make sense?
Sure. What did you end up, so you're at this advertising firm, you get the Durst account. In the end, what does that end up becoming in terms of your professional career?
After a few more accounts, my partner, Lanny Lambert, and I broke off from the agency and formed our own agency specializing in real estate advertising called Chavin Lambert.
And who was your biggest client?
Well, Durst was one, but Rockwell's Development was another one, and Brodsky was another one.
And the other two accounts that you mentioned, other than the Durst organization account, are those accounts that you believed that you and your agency were able to bring in because of your association with the Durst organization?
Yes, it became like a snowball where you're rolling down the hill. It self-accruing, and with each new account, it became a longer client list.
During this time when the defendant had offered you this account, and you'd taken it, how often were the two of you seeing each other?
Well, we would see each other socially, but in the service of the account at that time, we dealt more with Seymour Durst and David Durst, Bob's father and uncle. They were still running most of the Durst organization.
So Seymour would be the father, David would be the uncle?
Yes.
And is it your understanding that, I assume by now, you have a working knowledge of the Durst organization, is that correct?
Yes.
And is it fair to say that the Durst organization was originally founded by Seymour's father, Joseph?
Yes. To the best of my knowledge, yes.
And if I were to ask you, would that have been somewhere near the turn of the century?
Yes.
And I forgot the turn of another one. The turn of the beginning of the 1900s, somewhere around there.
Yes, yes.
And Seymour Durst was the eldest son of Joseph Durst, is that correct?
Correct.
And are you aware at the time that you knew Bob Durst, was Seymour in charge, the boss of the Durst organization?
Yes, and he was also a personal mentor to me in terms of learning about real estate.
I'm going to get into that. Do you know where Mr. Durst, defendant, do you know where he was in terms of the order of children of Seymour?
You mean in age?
In other words, do you know if Bob Durst has any brothers or sisters?
Yes, he
Do you
does.
know who they are?
Yes, I do.
Who are they?
He has a younger brother, Douglas, another younger brother, Tommy, and a sister named Alma, I believe.
Could it be Wendy?
I'm sorry, Wendy. I didn't know her. Bob was the oldest.
And you're aware you have a lot of experience and knowledge with the Durst organization, of the Durst organization, is that correct?
That's correct.
And historically, from what you know, did the oldest son take over for the father who was running the organization?
Yes, yes. The eldest son almost always was the heir to running the business.
And at the time that you met Bob Durst, was he the heir to leading the Durst organization?
To my knowledge, yes.
And had Bob Durst ever discussed with you, had he ever told you, hey, listen, I'm at this company and my dad is running and someday I'll be in charge?
No, not in those words, no.
Had he,
It was understood.
if I were to ask you, were you and Mr. Durst, in your mind, best friends?
Yes.
And did that status continue while Mr. Durst remained in New York?
Yes.
Have you ever said that you love Bob Durst like a brother?
Probably yes.
Who was the best man at your wedding?
Well, I had sort of two co-best men at my wedding, because there was really only 3 people in the wedding party.
And
He was Bob Durst and Richard Kinky Friedman.
And can you spell Richard Kinky Friedman?
RICHARDKINKYFRIEDMAN.
You said that Bob was at your wedding.
Yes.
And
Yes.
if I were to ask you if there's one person that you believe you have to thank for your eventual career in advertising, if you could had to name one person, who would it be?
It would be Bob, and his father would be a close second.
And you knew Bob's father, Seymour, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you describe how you knew Seymour Durst?
I knew him from weekly meetings, working with him on various Durst buildings, and then I knew him as Seymour wrote what were known as the bottom line notices on the front page of the New York Times, which were purchased a single line at the bottom with an editorial comment by someone, and we would compose those once a week. I would go over to his townhouse and we would sit around and have coffee and compose the next week's bottom line, or else do it on the phone.
How would you describe the closest of your relationship with Seymour?
I would say it's very, very close. At one time, Seymour and my father and Bob and I went out to dinner together, and that was just a wonderful time in New York. Seymour was a mentor in every way to me.
Did you know Douglas Durst?
Yes.
And can you describe how well you knew Douglas Durst and what your interactions were?
They were to some extent business, where both Bob and Douglas would be sitting in on would be the ones in charge of a project, and to some extent social. On a few occasions he hired my band to play at one of his parties, or several of his parties. But I didn't know, I wasn't as close to him anywhere near as I was to Bob.
Do you know the approximate age difference between Bob and Douglas?
It's 2 or 3 years. I don't know exactly.
And at that time, did you socialize with Douglas Durst outside of the Durst organization?
No, only at organized events, a party, or a birthday party of Douglas's, but I didn't go out with him separately and alone.
Through your observation, did Bob and his brother Douglas have a close relationship?
No, they did not.
And can you describe why you say that?
Well, because they didn't like each other.
And is that something you're speculating about, or is that something that Bob Durst spoke to you about?
I can remember on occasions Bob saying that he and Douglas were never close. They didn't like each other growing up, and they don't like each other now.
And by now meaning when?
Whenever it was he said it to me, yeah.
Did you ever have similar conversations with Douglas Durst about Bob?
No, I didn't know Douglas that well to do it.
Those conversations that you would have with Bob Durst, was that just one conversation, or was that a kind of a theme of whenever Douglas's name would come up?
It wasn't a theme, but it was mentioned a few times. Usually in response to a question I would have. I remember he said once that they went out of their way to not be in the same room together at the same time, except when they had to do business.
And this was taking place, if I were to ask you approximately, when these comments were being made?
In the early 90s. I'm not real good on dates, so I'm not going to swear to that.
Okay, I want to ask you about Kathy. Did you have a chance to interact with her?
Yes.
And what was Kathy like?
At the time that I met her, things were not going well between her and Bob.
So I want to stop you and try to ask you questions, go through them so I don't get the wrong area. Did you ever know Bob Durst when he was happy with Kathy? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I do, and I'm thinking, there were moments where he was. I've always felt that he loved her more than he's ever loved anyone else.
And I didn't ask that question correctly. What I meant was, that's my fault. By the time you met Bob, so you indicated that you thought Bob Durst was in 1980. Do you recall saying that?
Yes.
Do you recall, did you meet Kathy around that time as well?
Yes, a little bit later than that.
When you met Kathy, was she already in medical school?
Yes.
Do you recall where they were living, if they had more than one residence?
Yes, they were living on Riverside Drive, and I'm not sure if they had bought their Salem residence yet. They either have that Riverside Drive is the only one, or they also had a summer place sort of in South Salem.
South Salem is in Westchester County.
Westchester, yes.
They eventually bought a lakeside cottage, is that right?
That would be the South Salem place, right? Yes, I think.
At the time that you first met Kathy, do you recall what year of medical school she was in?
Well, it's not that I recall it, but it seems like it had to be the last or the second of the last year.
And how often would you see Bob and Kathy Durst together?
Not as often as I saw Bob, but I would say a few times. It's hard for me to say how many.
Well, I mean, if I were to ask you how many times you had gone out or seen Bob, would you be able to give a number?
Yeah, once a week.
And how often did you see Kathy?
Maybe once a month or
And
something.
were you able to witness how Bob and Kathy interacted with each other?
Yes, I think so.
Do you know the exact date? And I'm going to want to know the day of the week and the hour if you could give it to me. The times you observed Bob and Kathy together.
There is a time that I remember vividly, but I can't give you the date and the time, the hour.
Can you tell me approximately, let's go this way, about how long before Kathy vanished do you think that first?
I guess 8 or 9 years, maybe. No, wait. I don't know this. She vanished in 2001?
No, I'm asking about Susan Berman.
I'm sorry, it's Kathy?
So
I don't know the year that she vanished. I believe that, I'm not good on this with dates. I'd say a few years before she vanished, but not a long time.
okay, so if you can, then I'd like you to describe, do you have a better memory of what that encounter was like, or do you have a better memory of specifically what date the encounter took place? Put it another way, do you remember better what happened, what you saw, or do you remember better when it happened?
I remember better what I saw on the occasion I'm thinking.
What did you see? Go ahead.
We were going out one evening, out for dinner, Bob and Kathy and I went over to where they lived in Riverside Drive, which this is the first time I'd ever been there, Riverside Drive. And they were in mid-argument, and they didn't seem at all embarrassed about arguing out loud in front of me, and that was always very vivid to me.
Do you recall, was that arguing going both ways?
Yes.
And at the time that you met Kathy, you said she was in medical school, correct?
Yes.
And so, did you ever know Kathy when she wasn't in medical school?
I don't think so.
Did you see any difference in the time that you knew Kathy, the time that you knew Bob? Did you see any difference in how they interacted with each other over time? Or was it always the way that you just described?
It was always a strained relationship from the time I met them.
Did Bob Durst ever make any comments to you near this time about how he felt about his wife?
More often, Kathy would make comments about how difficult the marriage was to me. She would come over to my apartment. Kathy had come on numerous occasions to my apartment without Bob, alone in the evening, and she complained a lot about the relationship.
Did you and Kathy have anything other than a platonic relationship?
No, no, absolutely not.
And when Kathy would come on some of these occasions, can you describe what her demeanor was? Was she happy? Was she sad? How would you describe her demeanor?
Sad without question.
Clarify when?
He was speaking of the occasions when overall, it gets clear from the record. When she came to visit, but one you had established a period of time during which these visits took place.
And I think,
Early 80s.
what's that?
I believe it's the early 80s.
The time period, you are aware that Kathy Durst, at a point in time, ended up disappearing, is that correct?
Yes.
Mr. Chavin, if I were to ask you approximately, do you have a memory of approximately how long you knew Kathy Durst before she disappeared?
Yes, I'd say about 2 years.
So, I'll make sure I'm right on this. So the time that you described that you would see her, they would be during those 2 years you knew her, correct?
Yes.
So approximately, when do you think those several occasions were?
Between 1979, 80 and the time she disappeared.
And during those times, would Kathy complain about Bob?
Yes.
So I'd ask you, what would she say to you when she was describing the relationship?
The usual general complaints, he's impossible, I don't think we're going to stay together. She said she was afraid of him. She never said he hurt her, but just that she was afraid of him.
During any of these conversations that you had with her, was she ever emotional or upset?
Yes.
Do you recall, and I'm not directing you to the specific time, but the conversation where she said that she was afraid of him, do you remember, was that one time she said that she was afraid of him, more than one time? What do you remember?
I can remember more than one, but I can't exactly quantify. I was maybe 2 or 3.
During any of those times, at the time that Kathy was telling you that she was afraid of the defendant, was she upset?
Yes.
And can you describe what was it about her demeanor that led you to believe she was upset?
Well, it's not hard to tell when someone is upset. She would, on one occasion, she cried, and she was sad. On a few occasions, she came over with a friend, a medical student friend, so she wasn't as demonstrative. But she was appealing to me as Bob's friend to understand that she was having a terrible time with her marriage.
Did she, at any point in time, mention divorce?
I think it was more that we can't live together, but not divorce.
Was Bob the kind of guy at that time that you would sit down and have conversations with him about his marriage?
No.
As a guy, Bob obviously is a guy, did you guys have the kind of relationship where you would kind of sit down as maybe women are known to do and discuss your women troubles? Or was Bob more private about that?
He was more private, and if he was saying anything, it would be a general statement like, Kathy's just impossible sometimes. But not, we didn't sit down like girls do and talk about that. I don't mean that in any sexist way.
And you said that you never noticed any, Kathy never discussed with you any physical violence, is that correct?
Yeah, she was afraid of physical violence, but she never said he hit me or did this.
Over time that you knew Bob and Kathy, did you see Kathy become any less passive? Do you understand my question?
Yes, I do. I think so, yes, but I probably didn't know her when she was her most passive, probably early in their marriage.
By the time you knew Kathy, she was already past the point of being kind of a passive wife.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you yourself, personally, have you ever seen Bob Durst being physically violent? And that's what you yourself have witnessed.
With his wife or his...
With anybody.
There was one incident, but this is going to involve an opinion of mine.
I'm sorry?
There was one incident, but this is kind of an opinion of mine. Should I still?
No, I'm asking you simply, have you seen Mr. Durst, you witnessed him being physically violent?
Well, I would have to relate what happened to, and it's hard to explain. Because
Well, if you believe that your answer is responsive to my question, then go ahead. All right, go ahead.
we had gone to San Francisco together on a trip to San Francisco. This is after Kathy had disappeared. And we had split up when we were there for the day. Bob went to Berkeley, and I stayed in Marin County. Bob came back and said to me that he ran over a policeman. Okay. I said, how did that happen? And he said, we were driving, I was driving in Berkeley, and it was very slow traffic, 1 mile an hour. And there was a woman police officer that was directing traffic with her back to him. He's going about 1 mile an hour, and he hit her.
And did he explain to you why he had done that?
Well, I asked him, I said, how come you're still, you're not in jail? And he said, well, what's she gonna do? Go to her superiors and say someone was going 1 mile an hour and ran over me? So I think he did it in a prankish way. I think it was intentional.
Did Mr. Durst, when he was describing the story, did he mention to you that it was a prank, or is that what you decided?
He mentioned that when he did it, he knew he wasn't gonna get in trouble, and that she could not very well report this to her superiors.
And did he make it clear to you that he had done this on purpose or an accident?
It's my belief that it wasn't an accident.
Did he say whether it was on purpose or accident?
He led me to believe it was on purpose.
Did Mr. Durst ever talk to you about an incident that happened with an individual involving Kathy at their residence?
Yes, I'm sorry I didn't mention it when you asked me before.
Can you describe what Mr. Durst told you about this incident?
He told me that he kicked this guy in the head.
Can you describe, did he explain in more detail what exactly had happened?
Well, I asked him why, and he said the guy angered him. I think pissed him off was his words, and it had something to do with Kathy. I think he was flirting or doing something with Kathy.
Did Mr. Durst explain to you where this had happened?
Only, I thought he said Westchester, I'm just not sure.
No, it's not the city. Did he explain, was it at a business, at a residence?
No, it was at a residence.
And did he explain to you the circumstances of the individual that he kicked in the head, where that person was kind of physically located, how he had ended up kicking him in the head?
I was trying, actually I've talked about that before. I thought the guy was sitting on the floor. I mean, I assumed, he didn't say it really, but I don't see how he could have kicked him in the head if he was standing up. That's an assumption.
In telling the story, Mr. Durst left you with the impression that he had kicked the person while the person was on the ground.
That's the impression I got, or either sitting on the floor or reclining.
Did Mr. Durst, in telling you the story, did he in any way tell you that this was self-defense?
No, but he didn't say one way or the other.
Did he mention to you anything about any result that had happened because of this kick to the head?
I think he said that the man sued him.
Do you recall previously stating that he said he kicked someone in the head and now he's suing me?
Excuse me, let's leave. Yes.
And is that in fact accurate?
Seems accurate to me, yes.
Did he also, in essence, tell you that the guy was hitting on Kathy?
Yes, that was my memory.
When he was describing this, was he expressing any regret about what he had done?
No.
Was he upset, or did he explain that he was upset about getting sued?
He wasn't upset about that either.
Did you ever ask him any questions about whether or not he had physically abused Kathy ever?
No.
And given your relationship, is that the kind of thing you would have asked him?
No.
And did he ever volunteer any statements about physically abusing Kathy?
No.
I want to go to the point when Kathy disappeared. And again, you said that the date that I've given, sometime in late January, early February 1982, that sounds consistent with
Yes.
your memory?
Yes.
Do you remember how you heard that Kathy had disappeared?
I remember one of my first memories was seeing it on the front page of the New York Post, but I believe Bob told me before that.
At the time that Kathy disappeared, were you and Bob still best friends?
Yes.
Okay, let me ask you, at the time that Kathy disappeared, at that point, when is the last time you can remember that you'd seen Kathy? So had it been days, weeks, months, or do you know?
I don't know exactly, but I would say probably a few weeks prior.
And at the time that she disappeared, were you aware of the media? It was a pretty big media event in New York, is that right?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Tycoon's wife vanishes was the front page of the Post.
And by your memory, how big a story was that in New York City at the time as someone who was living there?
It was very big.
Do you remember at the time that this happened, that Kathy disappeared, was Bob Durst still close to Susan Berman?
Yes. Yes.
And you said that Bob Durst was your best friend. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you believe that you were Bob's best friend?
Next, possibly with the exception of Susan Berman, I thought I was. Maybe.
And did you believe that Susan was closer to Bob than you were?
Yes.
If I were to ask you to describe the relationship between Bob and Susan Berman, how would you characterize it?
As long-term best friends, I mean, they went back to UCLA in their friendship.
Can you tell me how Bob back then would talk about Susan in reference to how he valued her as a friend?
I don't understand that question.
Would Bob Durst ever tell you anything about how he felt about Susan?
Just that they were very close, and we would laugh about her eccentricities and such, but they were very, very close.
And with what you saw, did you believe that those feelings were reciprocated?
Yes. Susan often told me the same thing.
And when you said Susan would tell you the same thing, what would Susan tell you?
How much she loved Bobby.
Given the closeness of Bob and Kathy's relationship, I'm sorry, Bob and Susan's relationship, is there anything that you can think of that Susan would not have done for Bob?
No. Not if they were within her ability.
When Kathy disappeared, did you read any of the articles watching the coverage?
Yes.
At the time, you had said that you were aware of the coverage, is that correct?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
at the time that Kathy Durst disappeared, did you believe that Mr. Durst was involved in this disappearance?
No.
At that time, were there other people and media accounts who were suggesting the opposite?
Well, I think you're asking two questions, media and what people, individuals would
Well,
say.
in other words, you can combine, was there either media or other people? In other words, were there individuals who, unlike you, felt that Mr. Durst was involved in his wife's disappearance?
There were commercial brokers that were very sexist, that kind of got a kick out of someone getting away with their wife's disappearance, but the media was not suggesting that Bob had anything to do with it. That's my memory.
And let me ask you, Mr. Chavin, at the time that Kathy disappeared, were you in a position, in terms of your state of mind, to even entertain the idea that Mr. Durst could have been responsible?
Well, no, but I wasn't crazy. I mean, in my state of mind, I don't know what you mean. I did not think that Bob was in any way responsible.
At a later point in time, did you have a conversation, more than one conversation, with Susan Berman regarding this topic?
Yes.
Shall we return then at 10 a.m.?
Sure, that's right.
I'm going to recess for the day. Anything else I need to address before we recess for the day? I'm going to order the witness to return tomorrow. People were represented. The witness, Mr. Chavin, has resumed the witness stand. Mr. Chavin, you remain under oath. Mr. Lewin, you may continue with your examination.
Mr. Chairman, we were at the point yesterday where I had started to ask you whether or not you and Susan Berman had ever had any discussions regarding what had happened to Kathy. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Did you and Susan ever have such a discussion?
Yes, we had several.
And can you please tell me what Susan Berman said to you about what she knew regarding Kathy Durst's disappearance?
Susan said to me specifically that Bob killed Kathy, and I said, no, he didn't, and she said, yes, he did, and we argued about that. She said, we love both of them, Kathy's gone, we love Bob, we need to protect him. Bob killed Kathy. I said, how do you know? She said, he told me.
How many times did you and Susan have such a conversation?
Approximately half a dozen times. We argued on a consistent basis over that.
When you would argue about it, does that mean that when she originally told you, you didn't believe her?
That's correct.
Do you remember when these conversations with Susan Berman about Kathy took place in reference to when Kathy died? And I want to be clear, I'm not asking you to name a year, but I'm asking, was it closer in time to when Kathy disappeared, or was it closer in time to when Susan got murdered, or was it throughout that time period?
It was closer in time to when Kathy disappeared.
Mr. Chavin, when Susan Berman made these comments to you, and you said you would argue,
Yes.
was it clear to you that she was not joking around?
Oh, yes. I never thought she was joking. At first, I just thought she was giving an opinion.
And when she told you that Bob had told her he had done it, was she clear about that?
Yes, and that was when I began to, how I should say it, that I had doubts that perhaps he did.
Given your friendship with Bob Durst at the time, was it hard for you to accept that what Susan was telling you might be true?
Very hard.
And can you tell us why?
My relationship with Bob was very close, and I couldn't believe that he would have committed a crime like that. I just couldn't believe it.
During these conversations that you had with Susan Berman, did you ever ask her for any further details about what Bob had told her?
Well, after I asked her, I said, how do you know? I said that rather belligerently. She said, because he told me. And the only further details were that we have to do what we can to protect him.
During any of the times that you spoke to Susan Berman about what had happened to Kathy, did Susan Berman at any time mention anything about Robert Durst, quote, confiding, unquote, in her to, quote, more easily set up an alibi, unquote?
I don't recall her using the word alibi.
Do you recall what you remember of the words she said?
We have to help him.
Well, the best that you can. Let me ask you this. Have you mentioned, and I want to go back, do you know who Julie Smith is?
Yes.
Who is Julie Smith?
Well, she's a writer and a friend of Susan, so I met through Susan.
Did you go to Susan's memorial?
Yes.
And did that take place approximately February 1st, 2001?
I believe so, yes.
And do you recall having a conversation with Julie Smith at that time?
Yes, I do.
And do you recall the nature of that conversation with Julie Smith?
It was approximately the same. Well, I related to her the conversations, plural, that I had with Susan. Susan.
Does that mean you told Julie Smith what Susan Berman had told you about Kathy?
Yes.
And you repeated this statement that Susan Berman had told you back in 2001?
Yes, I did.
Smith? Mr. Chavin. At the time, was there a time, you originally said that you would argue with Susan Berman about the defendant's involvement in his wife's disappearance,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Was there a time when you yourself began to question if maybe you were wrong?
Yes.
Can you tell me when that was?
It was exactly when I asked her, how do you know? Because I was pretty sure that she couldn't have known. And she said, because he told me.
With your testimony, Mr. Chavin, you are describing having known this information for many, many years before that information was ever communicated to authorities. Is that correct?
Yes, but I had told people.
Okay, I want to ask you, when you eventually decided or had questions in your mind, you know what, gosh, maybe Bob Durst killed his wife, how come you didn't at that point go to the police and tell them what you knew?
I did when they came to me.
Ron, here's what I'm asking you. You knew about, or suspected, you started to believe that Bob Durst was involved in his wife's disappearance and death years before Susan was ever murdered. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And did you come forward at that point in time?
No, I didn't.
Can you tell me why?
It didn't seem that it was my place to do that, and I'm relating something told to me. I never really thought about it, except I really don't have an answer for that.
Did you still, at that point in time, did you still have strong feelings about Bob?
I still had strong feelings as opposed to beliefs.
So in other words, did you still care about him?
Yes.
You said that you and Susan Berman had these conversations about Bob on more than one occasion, his involvement in Kathy's death, correct?
Correct.
Did Susan repeat to you on more than one occasion her comment that, in essence, Kathy's dead, we can't do anything about it, and we have to protect Bob?
Yes. Yes, she did.
Was that a theme of Susan's that she would repeat whenever you two would discuss the information that she had about Kathy?
Yes, I don't know if it was a theme, but it was certainly mentioned on several occasions. Then we stopped talking about it.
Did you ever ask Susan for any further details other than what you described?
No, I didn't.
Did you want to know the details?
I don't think so.
And do you know why?
Because my own rationale is there are many reasons why something like that could have happened. And I really didn't want to know. It seemed
You said that you remembered speaking to Julie Smith at Susan's memorial. I'm going to back up a bit, and I want to go back to the time in New York when you remember Bob Durst left. Do you know what I'm referring to?
yes.
Was there a period of time where basically you lost contact with Mr. Durst?
Yes, there was.
Was that at your desire or your choice, or was that Mr. Durst?
That was entirely Mr. Durst's.
Can you describe approximately when it was and what happened?
I can describe what I believe was when it happened. I was at the Durst organization at the request of his brother Douglas, who wanted to talk to me about an impending job, advertising job. I was in the waiting room at the Durst organization waiting for a meeting with Douglas. And Bob called from his office and said he heard I was out there. Did I want to come down to his office? And I said, no, I have a meeting with Douglas first. I have to talk to Douglas. And that was the last time Bob spoke to me for many years. I never forgot that.
In the interim, so you had that meeting with Douglas, did you become aware at that point or shortly thereafter that there had been a change or an announcement of who was going to be heading the Durst organization?
I believe it was shortly after that.
And who ended up taking charge?
Douglas Durst and his cousin Jonathan Durst.
Was this the position that you had testified previously that your friend Bob had expected to be assuming himself?
Yes, in my opinion.
And when you talked to Bob Durst that day, did he mention to you anything about, I'm upset, or I'm leaving, or was it the extent of what you testified to?
It was the extent of what I testified to, and it was obvious, and right after it happened, I thought, oops.
Well, what do you mean you thought it was right after what
I
happened?
realized that that was a destructive thing to say in terms of our relationship, mine and Bob's.
And when you said meeting, telling him you had a meeting with Douglas?
Yes.
How did you become aware after that point that Bob Durst had left New York?
Well, I called him repeatedly and I couldn't get an answer, and then I believe I found out through my wife, Teresa, who was working for Deborah Sheraton, who was a close friend of Bob's. I don't know if they were married then or not, but And I also found out from Deborah Lee Sheridan, that Bob had left.
Can you spell your wife's name?
Teresa.
You also will call her Terry.
Terry, yes, that's correct.
And when you're using Terry, is it with an I or a Y?
Wow, excuse me. It's with
You
an
need
I.
to get this one right.
I need to get this one right, that's right, correct. It's with an I. No, I'm sorry, excuse me. Oh, my daughter is Brandy with an I. Terry is with a Y. I'm sorry, terribly sorry, Terry.
During this period of time, when Mr. Durst left New York, did he attempt to contact you that you're aware of?
No,
Did he explain to you prior to leaving, write, do anything to let you know where he was going?
no.
Did he tell you, even during the meeting that you had with him, did he?
There was no meeting with him.
No, I'm sorry. When you went up and to speak to him, he called you. You went up to speak with him. Were you aware at that point that he was upset?
No, I felt I made him upset. I'm sorry.
Never mind.
Yeah, so what I was asking was, in other words, you had this conversation with Bob Durst.
Yes.
And either you could have left not realizing there was anything at all that happened, or there could have been something during the exchange where you said, wow, I guess I said something. Which was it?
It was the latter of what you said.
And if you can recall, as best you can, what was it you said, and what was Mr. Durst's reaction?
I said that I was waiting to speak with Douglas, who had called me over.
And how did he react at that point?
I think we just hung up then. It was something like, okay, goodbye. It was very terse. Terse.
So it was clear to you even during that conversation that you would upset him?
Absolutely. And I always believed that. I never could find out for sure, but I always believed that.
When you would hear either through Deborah Cherry or through your wife, did you know even what state your friend Bob Durst was living in?
I believe I found out from my wife that he was in California. And then also I found out that he was living in Soho.
Your wife, Terry, was she working at that time for the Durst organization?
No.
Does she work for the Durst organization now?
Yes.
What does she do for the Durst organization?
She's one of many, many leasing brokers that lease apartments there.
And is the Durst organization a small place, or is it a large firm with many, many employees?
It's a large firm with many, many, many employees.
The Durst organization, is it fair to say that they are one of the leading owners of commercial property in Manhattan?
Yes.
Are you aware whether or not they have an interest in what used to be the World Trade Center, the World Trade Towers?
Yes, they are a partial owner in a complicated relationship of the new World Trade Tower, One World Trade, or the Freedom Tower, whatever you want to call it. It's complicated. I believe that they exchanged a large tenant of theirs that took about over 500,000 square foot of space for partial ownership, and then contributed some money, were involved in construction, and they're between them and the Port Authority. I'm not sure who's the actual entitled, but they're one of them.
And your knowledge of the Durst organization, you have that through your dealings in advertising, is that correct?
In real estate advertising, yes.
And if I were to ask you, who is the person that is in charge of the Durst organization today?
Today, Helena Durst.
And who was it previous to Helena?
Douglas Durst.
And Helena's relationship to Douglas?
She's his daughter.
And Douglas Durst headed the firm for more than 20 years, is that correct?
I don't know if it's been that long since Seymour Durst stepped down, but probably.
Did Seymour Durst die in the mid-90s? Do you know?
As I said before, I'm not good on dates. I can remember the events around it. I believe that's correct, yeah.
In terms of your wife's job at the Durst organization, does she work directly with Douglas every day?
No, she never sees Douglas.
Is it fair to say that Douglas is, in essence, when he was there, he was in charge of a giant organization, and there are many layers of employees?
There are many layers of employees in an organization. Her direct reports are probably 3 or 4 layers between someone named Durst and her.
And the someone named Durst and her wouldn't even be Douglas. Douglas would be on top of that.
That's correct.
So, Mr. Durst leaves. At some point after that, do you recall Seymour Durst passing away?
Yes, I do.
And if I were to tell you mid-90s, does that sound right, or do you have no idea?
It sounds right, but the actual dates are not one of my strengths.
When Seymour Durst died, did you go to the funeral?
I went to the memorial.
And was the whole family, for the most part, that you can recall, the whole Durst family at the memorial?
With the exception of Bob.
Did you attempt to get in touch with him at the time that his father died?
Yes, I did.
What did you try and do?
Well, I called him and repeatedly got no answer and no voicemail. And then I wrote him, after the memoriam, I wrote him a long letter.
Did Deborah Cheriton convey to you a response?
Yes, she did.
Can you please tell me what that response was?
Yes, the response was 2 words. It's maudlin. That was what Bob had told Deborah.
And when Deborah conveyed this to you, did she tell you that she was conveying what Bob had told her, or did she tell you, this is my response, did she just not say?
No, she said that was Bob's response.
When is the next time, approximately, you can remember that you heard from Bob? And I'm not asking you to give an exact year, it's going to be weeks, months, years after that.
Years went by. And then,
go ahead, sir.
And then the next time I heard from him was a phone call from Galveston, from Texas, where he was. And he asked, should I continue?
No, let me stop you. The call that you got from Galveston, was that from jail?
Yes.
And at that point, that was after Susan Berman had been murdered, is that correct?
Such a fundamental question, I don't know. It was concerning the time when Morris Black was murdered.
I want you to assume, going forward, I want you to assume that Morris Black was murdered Morris Black was killed in September of 2001. And I want you to assume that Susan Berman was killed in December of 2000. So, for the next question, I want you to assume that. Are you understand what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I see why I'm confused too.
Do you recall your contact, and we go back to Susan Berman, at the time that Bob Durst left New York, were you and Susan and Bob still close, the 3 of you, before Bob left?
Yes, but she was in California, so we didn't see each other as a threesome much, except to visit there.
Did you and Bob Durst still have the same closeness in your relationship up until that meeting, that conversation on the phone?
Yes.
As you did originally?
Yes.
And were you aware, did Bob Durst communicate to you that he still had a close relationship with Susan?
There was a time when we visited Susan in California, Bob and I together, and I'm just trying to place when that was in the timeline. But I'd say yes.
And were you still, even though Susan was in California, did you have as close a relationship with her when she left New York to go back to California as you did when she was in New York?
Absolutely, yes. She even came and stayed with us in New York.
During that period of time, when you would talk to Susan, and I'm talking about after Bob Durst left New York,
Right,
that period of time, you're not talking to Bob Durst at all, is that correct?
correct.
Did Susan Berman, was she communicating to you, I'm still talking to Bob?
Yes. Possibly not frequently, but yes, she was.
And at that point in time, if I were to ask you, who had a closer relationship with Bob Durst, you or Susan Berman, who would it have been?
Susan Berman.
If I were to ask you, you said Bob was your best friend, if I were to ask you, over the entire time that you knew Susan Berman and Bob Durst, did you ever have a closer relationship with Bob Durst than Susan did?
Closer is a difficult word. I saw Bob more frequently. I mean, I don't know how to measure that.
Let me ask you this. Has Bob Durst himself, Bob Durst, has he ever told you that he killed Kathy Durst?
No.
As you sit here today, and I'm asking to assess your relationship, did you and Bob have a relationship where you confided in each other regarding the issues in your lives, or was it more of a situation where you were like buddies who went out on the town?
It was both.
Was it more one than the other, or was it equal?
Considering that Bob, in my opinion, is more personal and closer to the vest, and I don't know that he confided in anyone really, we went out on the town more often than we had deep conversations about each other's lives.
Based on your relationship with Susan and Bob, do you have an opinion as to whether or not Bob Durst confided more in Susan than he did in you?
Yes, I have an opinion.
And what's that opinion?
That he would have confided more with Susan than with me.
By the way, you previously said a word. You repeated that Deborah Jarecki had responded, "That's maudlin." And obviously, and this is interesting, I'm of course looking at my yellow sticky that says explain maudlin. I don't know that necessarily that's really for the witness to do. I'm going to ask, what did you take maudlin?
Sloppily sentimental, overly sentimental, embellishingly sentimental, not very convincing. It's everything bad, everything negative in my associations with maudlin, overly sentimental.
Did you have a pocket thesaurus right there? That was
No, I'm familiar with the word, and it certainly made me feel awful. You write something pouring your heart out, and someone says it's maudlin.
All right, I want to now go back to Susan Berman's death. Do you remember how it was that you heard about it?
Oh, yes, I do. There was a time when a reporter from the New York Times, when just as the case, I believe, about Kathy's disappearance was being reopened, this reporter was asking me questions about Susan Berman, and I said, I think there's someone more knowledgeable you could talk to than me. You should talk to Susan Berman in California. I said, okay. Then a few days later, I got a phone call in the morning getting out of the cab at work, and it was the reporter. Am I supposed to mention his name?
Yes.
Charles Bagley. And he said...
Let me stop you. Is that B-A-G-L-Y?
No.
You know what?
L-I or L-Y, I'm not sure.
I think for the record, I'm very confident it's B-A-G-L-I.
Yeah, it should be too.
You did better on modeling.
I didn't. He said, "Did you see the paper this morning?" I said, "No." And he said, "Susan Berman has been murdered." And then he proceeded to say that this was a television show. It seemed too predictable and ridiculous.
Mr. Bagley, I believe, is present again today, reporting. I'm not sure. But I think so.
He is.
All right, record shall so reflect.
I believe the conversation was something like, in a poorly written TV show, the reporter would ask about someone, he'd be given a number and a name, and then the next day they're murdered.
And I want to back up a little bit.
I was flabbergasted.
You had said that you received a call from Mr. Bagley to contact you, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that
Yes,
a yes?
yes, that's a yes.
At that time, were you already aware that there was a reinvestigation going on into Kathy Durst's disappearance by the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, Janine Pirro?
Yes, I was.
And it had been publicized in the papers, is that right?
I believe so, yes.
And so you said that Mr. Bagley called you, and what was the purpose in that?
Well, the first phone call or the second phone call?
What's the first one?
Well, the first one was just asking me questions about Susan, and I said, I think there's, I mean, asked me questions about Kathy and Bob, and I said, I think there's a person that knows Bob better that you might want to talk to. I was trying to get out of the conversation, and I gave him Susan's name and number.
Why did you help Mr. Bagley?
I didn't think of it so much as helping him. I thought the case, no offense, was cold and over. I didn't think it was a viable, even though it was being reopened, I really thought it was over. There was no indictment brought. I didn't think Bob was even a serious suspect, and I didn't think about it.
Did you?
I gave him several other names too.
Did you believe that by giving him, Mr. Bagley, Susan Berman's name, that if Mr. Bagley contacted Susan Berman, that she was going to repeat to him what she had said to you?
I never thought about that. I just didn't. I gave him, I said several names, 3 or 4 names of people that knew Susan.
And so you give him these names.
Not people that knew Susan, excuse me, people that knew Bob.
So you give him these names, and then a very short period of time later, you get a second call.
Yes, that's correct.
And so was it Mr. Bagley? Is that how you found out Susan had been murdered?
Yes, as I said. I had no idea before that.
If you can remember, I know you said you're not good on dates, but if you can remember, when is the last time you believe you had talked to Susan before that?
Just within the last month, I can't say what date, but we weren't strangers to each other. We were talking on the phone.
And when you had talked to her, had you discussed, or do you remember, had you talked about Robert Durst at all?
No, I think we were talking about a play that she was involved in writing. We were talking about her career.
During your phone conversation, did Susan Berman express any concerns to you about her safety or any concerns about being harmed?
No, but she said, no, with the exception that she said she was writing a very interesting and possibly dangerous work.
Did she expand on what that was?
No, but this was like Susan to exaggerate something like that. But she said it was very, not touchy, I'm looking for the word for some reason. It was sensitive and secret, what she was writing.
So you hear from Mr. Bagley, and then subsequent to that, you end up going out for the memoriam, is that correct?
That's correct.
Was Bob Durst at the memoriam?
No.
Were many of Susan's friends that you knew there?
Yes.
Was it a, for lack of a better term, a large gathering, a big production?
It was pretty large. There were more people than are in the room here now.
And is that the time when you had the conversation with Julie Smith?
It was right as when the memoriam ended, we walked out in the hallway, and then there was a conversation between people who couldn't have talked during it, and it was at that time.
At this point in time, had you gone to the police in any jurisdiction to tell them what you knew, what Susan had told you about Bob's responsibility for Kathy's death?
The police, specifically Joseph Sarah, came and interviewed me. And
I just listed my question.
and I gone?
I'm going to get to that point. I'm asking, up to this point,
Yes.
have you gone to the police yet?
No.
And in fact, did you contact the police, or did the police end up contacting you?
Excuse me one second.
Okay.
The police contacted me. The Westchester Police, I believe.
Did you, when you say the police, you mentioned New York State Police Investigator Joseph Becerra?
Yes, I didn't realize he wasn't Westchester at that time.
Do you know him as Joey Becerra?
I know him as Joseph Becerra.
Handsome guy?
I guess so. Reasonably so.
So Investigator Becerra comes out and you speak to him. And does he ask you a series of questions?
Yes.
And right now, asking about what happened in an interview that's 16 years old, do you remember specifically everything that you discussed in the interview?
I remember many of the things.
And were you interviewed by Detective Becerra? Were you interviewed on more than one occasion?
No. Not that I can recall. I think there was just one. He was with another officer, and the other officer interviewed my wife, Teresa, while he interviewed me. It took place in a restaurant.
If I were to say March 1st of 2001, meaning a month or so after the memoriam, does that sound about right?
Yes.
During that time, did you relate to Detective Becerra what Susan Berman had told you about Bob's involvement in Kathy's death?
Yes, I did.
Did you also relate to him during that interview that you knew this information because, I'm sorry, that Susan told you she knew this information because Bob had told her that?
Yes.
We paused the video, 1 hour, 30 minutes, and 4 seconds.
Ladies and gentlemen, do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with the case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. Will return at 1:30.